I would like to introduce myself to you before beginning this video. I'm a retired professor of radiology from the University of Sydney, and before that I was a staff radiologist at Prince Alfred Hospital in Sydney. I first became involved with the thalidomide children when they were aged 9, 10 and 11, and that was as a result of an 11-year court case in Germany where the children there had finally got a verdict that thalidomide had caused their birth defects. Seems a terribly long way round to have to do it through a courtroom. Anyway, subsequent to that, thalidomide children from all around the world were able to claim compensation and get on with their lives. Because I've been researching it for such a long time, I'd already decided to write a book in 2007, and that was published in England, and it's called Beyond Thalidomide, Birth Defects Explained, in which we've incorporated most of the research that we did at Sydney University, plus a whole lot of research from other laboratories and other workers throughout the world. The thalidomide story. Today I'm going to put thalidomide into its historical background, pointing out the Australian contributors as we go. The introduction will be followed by the story of 4 epidemics. Now, the thalidomide story begins in 1945 in Germany at the end of the Second World War. Dresden, typical of the German cities that were wrecked. Once renowned for its chemical industries, Germany now struggled to rebuild factories on the rubble of its smashed cities. The final slide shows Stolberg, which is where thalidomide was made. The next series of slides show that the winners of the war met at Yalta in 1945 and divided Europe between them, setting the scene for the Cold War, in which fascism was replaced by communism as the enemy of the Western Allies, confronting capitalism at the Iron Curtain in Germany. Roosevelt at Yalta was clearly dying. The Marshall Plan from the United States helped the post-war recovery of the vanquished nations of Europe, and here it is being signed by President Truman, who succeeded Roosevelt. And finally we see Germans welcoming United States dollars through the Marshall Plan. Slide 3, 1945 in Britain, shows that Britain was also bombed. The Lend-Lease scheme had brought armaments and food from the United States, which were essential for the British to win the war, but it caused an enormous debt. As a victor, Britain did not qualify for Marshall Plan dollars. In 1945, President Truman unexpectedly terminated the Lend-Lease scheme and requested that Britain repay the debt. This helped to bankrupt the British government, plunge the British nation into austerity, and confirm the end of the British Empire. The next slide also shows 1945 in Britain, and that not all was doom and gloom in that year. Here is Howard Florey, an Australian doctor who became Professor of Pathology in Oxford. He shared the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 1945 for developing penicillin, a wonder drug. Florey was commemorated years later on our Australian $50 banknote. Penicillin had been used by the Allied armies at the end of the war when it had saved many lives. And here we see an agar plate where the fungus grows, the Staphylococcus will not grow. This was Fleming's fundamental observation. Post-war, one result of the penicillin discovery was a worldwide expansion in the pharmaceutical industry. New wonder drugs were sought. There was clearly money to be made, unimpeded by regulations in those days, and so Big Pharma was born. This was the seedbed from which thalidomide emerged. Next slide shows that the bankrupt British government, strapped for cash, taxed alcohol and tobacco to the point where the man in the street couldn't afford to drink or to smoke. Caught up in this squeeze was the giant whisky producer, Distillers Company of Scotland. Their falling profits were presented at a gloomy board meeting in Edinburgh in 1956. One board member said that he'd read Brave New World, in which Aldous Huxley predicted that in the future sedative pills were going to replace alcohol and religion as the opiate of the masses. The board of distillers sat up. Perhaps their company should diversify into sedative drugs. Their medical man scouted around in Central Europe for the best new sedative drug, and he returned with a clear answer: thalidomide. Thus, distillers acquired from Chemie Grünenthal the franchise for selling thalidomide to the British Commonwealth along their Johnnie Walker whisky trade routes. By 1956, then, we have a German soap and cosmetics manufacturer and a Scotch whisky maker now selling a drug for human consumption. Both were motivated to improve their profits by diversification into human pharmaceuticals, an industry to which they were both newcomers. Typifying the rush to find wonder drugs in the early 1950s, a German manufacturer of soaps and cosmetics, Chemie Grünenthal, decided to diversify into pharmaceuticals, hoping to find an antibiotic. Their first two antibiotic projects actually failed. They invented thalidomide, known in Germany as Contergan, as an antihistamine, which it turned out not to be, but it did make laboratory rats drowsy. So it was marketed as a light sedative from 1956, and by 1961 it had captured 40% of the sedative market in Germany. It was adopted by Distillers Company in the UK and sold there as Distaval. Why was it so successful? Because it was allegedly so safe. Having no lethal dose, it could not kill, a unique property and a strong selling point for a sedative in those days of barbiturate and narcotics. But successful sedation came at a price. Thalidomide caused tingling, numbness, and shooting pains in the feet and the hands of people who took it as a sedative. These were symptoms of sensory peripheral neuropathy, in other words, sensory nerve damage. And this did not reverse when the drug was stopped. GPs realised that this safe drug was not safe at all. Ironically, the page facing this advertisement in the BMJ was of letters to the editor reporting cases of sensory neuropathy after thalidomide sedation. In the 1950s, German and British neurologists proved that thalidomide poisoned sensory nerves, causing often permanent damage to the longest nerves, those to the feet and the hands. Conduction studies in these people were abnormal, and the neuropathologists, getting hold of some tissue, demonstrated axonal damage, a dying back of axons from their distal tips, classified in the textbooks as axonal degeneration. The next slide is a very important one. It's the pathology behind or underlying the first thalidomide epidemic in adults. And I want you to memorize this slide because it is what thalidomide does to nerves. And it's from a 1960s paper co-authored by an Australian neurologist, Dr. Dudley O'Sullivan, then working in London. He reviewed adults with thalidomide neuropathy 6 years after their diagnosis in order to examine the results long term of this neuropathy. And he found that 75% still had symptoms 6 years later, only 25% recovered. Thus the neuropathy was often permanent, which is the mark of a strong neurotoxin. This slide compares a cross-section of a normal peripheral nerve below with that of an age-matched patient with thalidomide neuropathy above, 6 years after stopping the drug. The difference is obvious. O'Sullivan actually measured the difference in the axon populations, that is, he recorded the sizes and the numbers of the axons present. Now, in any normal peripheral nerve trunk like the one at the bottom, the axon sizes range from small to large, and they have a basically bimodal distribution shown in the graph beside it. However, in thalidomide-damaged nerves like the pictures above, the distribution of axon sizes is unimodal, with loss of all the large fibres and increased numbers of small-sized fibres. So thalidomide did 3 things to peripheral sensory nerves. It obliterated large diameter fibres, replaced them with small fibres, and many of them, multiple small fibres, and that is the normal response of nerves to injury. And thirdly, it reduced the cross-sectional area of the affected nerve trunks. Thus, the first thalidomide epidemic was an outbreak of sensory peripheral neuropathy, and it left many adults disabled, unable to feel their own feet and hands thereafter. It's a very serious affliction. It's crippling. German neurologists successfully lobbied their state health authorities to alter the drug's status from sales over the counter to on medical prescription only. This was implemented, and it caused a sharp drop in sales and profits. Chemie Grünenthal responded in 1957 by launching thalidomide into a new market, decided by their sales committee, and the market was as an anti-nauseant for morning sickness of pregnancy. A year later, in 1958, a sudden epidemic of previously rare birth defects erupted in several countries, worst in West Germany. Its cause was a mystery, and it took 4 years to identify thalidomide as the culprit. The epidemic of birth defects was odd in 2 particular ways. First of all, there was a widespread anatomic spectrum of birth defects, and secondly, there was a very peculiar geographic distribution. Classically, there were limb reductions, and these were obvious to all. But there were also reductions in ears and eyes, fairly obvious. But the much more serious defects were not seen at all. They were hidden in other organs such as the heart, gut, kidney, etc. And some of these were lethal at birth. For instance, atresias and stenoses in the internal organs, especially the gut, and septal defects in the heart killed many neonates. Infant mortality rate around birth was 40%. Other internal malformations were diagnosed as time passed. The next slide shows the geography of the second epidemic, which was very odd. West Germany, for instance, had thousands of deformed babies, and East Germany had none. Birth defects stopped at the Iron Curtain. In North America, Canada had over 150, but the United States had almost none. Defects stopped at the 49th parallel. Britain had about 800 cases, and the British Commonwealth was certainly afflicted. Australia suffered 45. German doctors sought the cause. Lenz, a paediatrician in Hamburg, had already seen 46 such babies when in 1961 a new mother told him that she had taken 1 thalidomide tablet in early pregnancy. Lenz got from his hospital dispensary a sample of every preparation that contained thalidomide, and he lined these up on his desk. He then recalled the mothers of the deformed babies, and 41 of them identified a thalidomide preparation she'd taken in early pregnancy. So thalidomide was the common factor. Lenz presented his findings at a meeting of paediatricians in Dusseldorf on the 18th of November 1961 and warned European doctors through a German medical journal 4 days later. On the 16th of December 1961, McCredie, a Sydney obstetrician, published a letter in The Lancet with the same message, warning the English-speaking world. 2 independent reports from different parts of the world forced the companies to withdraw thalidomide from European and British markets. The next slide shows a graph drawn by Lenz of the subsidence of the second thalidomide epidemic. 8 months later, after the detection and the withdrawal from the market, the epidemic of birth defects ceased in those countries. Now we can have another look at the second thalidomide epidemic and its geography, and we can explain it. Thalidomide, as we've seen, emanated from West Germany. Now the East Germans had refused to let it into their market because their scientists were not convinced of its safety or efficacy. So it was sales, not science, that explained why birth defects stopped at the Iron Curtain. In North America, the story was a little bit different. In the United States, the Food and Drug Administration, known as FDA, had been established pre-war to license all new medicines before their admission to the American market. And here we have Dr. Francis Kelsey, a vigilant young Canadian pharmacologist, newly appointed to the FDA in Washington, who examined thalidomide's license application and uncovered the fact that it had never been proved safe for the embryo in pregnancy. She refused the application and saved the American public from disaster. Very few birth defects happened in the United States unless the drug had been obtained abroad. A cluster of cases occurred in families of the United States Rhine Army soldiers from occupied Germany. Meanwhile, Canada suffered an epidemic of over 150 cases. And again, it was sales, not science, that explained the border phenomenon. The next slide takes us to the aftermath in Germany in the 1960s. In Aachen, Germany, the first court case began in 1961. Parents of a group of German Kontergan Kinder sued Chemie Grünenthal for compensation. Costly expenses were foreseen for these very disabled youngsters. The worst afflicted, eyeless, earless, limbless, had to be institutionalized. Here we see some of the other children growing up. The less disabled could live at home, but they needed wheelchairs, prostheses, chairlifts on stairs, and constant carers to help with eating, dressing, moving about, toileting, and so on. Maintenance costs were very high. The German litigation went through a labyrinth of legalistic twists and turns, and after 9 years the courts established that thalidomide had caused the defects. But the courts stopped short of criminal charges. Chemie Grünenthal paid 100 million Deutschmarks to the children, and the West German government took over responsibility for their ongoing compensation via a new health department modality. The Kontergan case stands as the second most expensive and second longest litigation in German legal history, second only to the Nuremberg trials. As their first and last venture into pharmaceuticals, thalidomide was a disaster for distillers in Britain. and they exited the pharmaceutical industry forever. But first there had to be some settlement with the victims. The next slide shows the 1970s aftermath in Britain. Once the cause was approved by the German courts, distillers actually made an offer, but they capped it, and it was only made to a group of 28 British cases. It worked out at a very mean sum per child, and the British public considered it inadequate. In particular, the Sunday Times was outraged. Its editor, Harold Evans, led a campaign to extract a better deal for the children. Shareholders in distillers actually rallied behind the Sunday Times. Harold Evans was at risk of going to jail, and the British public boycotted whisky. Politicians got involved, taking the matter to Westminster. A number of issues came up before both Houses of Parliament at Westminster, entwined with matters such as the rights of the unborn, contempt of court, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, public liability insurance, and disability compensation. A settlement was reached finally in 1973, and the children were later on supported by an entity called the Thalidomide Trust, which was set up and funded by Distillers Company. Following German litigation, compensation became available worldwide from 1971. The children, now aged 9 to 12 years, were medically assessed to equate the money to their degree of disability. Distillers was sued by the Australian families, and the case went to the Privy Council in London. Large amounts of money attracted into the queue handicapped children of all sorts, some with no history of thalidomide exposure at all. In Sydney, McCredie asked me to review the radiographs of the Australian claimants in order to separate the true thalidomide cases from others on radiological grounds. At first I was shocked and bewildered by the range and severity of thalidomide damage, shown in this slide. No left arm in one child, no radius in 2 cases, 5 dislocated joints, and 1 case of polydactyly. What a mess, you might say, of the skeleton. I wondered how thalidomide could do this. How did this drug work? That question had never been answered. I happened to be a Sudoku addict, and I became hooked on the puzzle of how thalidomide did this damage. As I studied the X-ray films, I became aware of an anatomic pattern in the allegedly disorderly limb defects. The pattern in the bones appeared to be a failure of formation of bones supplied by segmental sensory nerves. Here we've got the segmental sensory nerve to the 6th cervical dermatome, that is the skin of the arm supplied by that nerve, and you can see that if you cut that skin away and all the bones underneath, you would end up with absence of the thumb and radius, which was the commonest of all the arm defects in thalidomide. The next slide shows Charcot's joints in newborns affected by thalidomide. Charcot's joints are normally seen in adults with long-standing sensory nerve damage. But here we had evidence of Charcot's joints in the newborn. So, both of these observations pointed to sensory nerves as the target of the drug. This was a brand new interpretation. We'll follow it. But the next slide shows the neural crest, and the radiology was certainly very clear. Thalidomide must target the sensory nerves of the embryo, the same target in the embryo as in the adult. And here you have the evolution of sensory nerves from the neural crest in the embryo. So this looked like being neural crest injury. The next slide is an important one, and it shows the timelines of events in the early human embryo. And the chronology is very important, and much of this was put together by Lenz in Germany, and other items have come out of straight-out embryology textbooks. Now, the neural crest is present when thalidomide attacks the embryo. The arm bud, however, is not present until 4 days after thalidomide has caused upper limb defects. So the drug is certainly not acting within the limb bud. Toxicologists in Berlin, using thalidomide in primates, found exactly the same phenomenon, and they concluded that the drug was acting deep to the site of the future limb bud in the torso of the embryo. And that is exactly where the neurites are sprouting on their way from the neural crest to the presumptive area of the limb bud. Now we come upon a problem. There's a disagreement among biologists. The biologists who study embryonic limb growth, and usually using chick embryos, they believe that limbs grow without a nerve supply and that the nerve supply comes in later, attaching itself to appropriate organs. That's one group. There's a second group of biologists who study limb regeneration in the amphibia, and they're of exactly the opposite opinion. They've actually shown and proved that limbs will not grow without a sensory nerve supply. Clearly, there is dissension in the ranks of the biologists. I examined both arguments, and the regeneration biologists certainly had the stronger data. They were led by this man, Professor Marcus Singer of Cleveland, Ohio, who proved that limb growth in amphibia is dependent upon sensory nerves. Singer found that without sensory nerves, limbs will not regrow. I found Singer's research much more convincing than that of the teratologists and embryologists. I did not believe the mantra that there were no nerves in early limb buds, and I found that it was actually based on a misquotation of results from a study done in 1900, where no nerves were seen with the light microscope, which magnifies to 800 times at best. We repeated that study using the electron microscope that magnifies up to 100,000 times, much more powerful than the light microscope. So in our neurology lab at Sydney University, Dr. John Cameron found axons in the limb buds of rabbits using modern tissue preparation and electron microscopy. So the statement that there are no nerves in embryonic limb buds is simply not true, although people who believe it continue to make it. The embryology textbooks are going to have to be rewritten around this finding. And again, in our neurology lab at Sydney University, Catherine North looked at the nerve supply to the leg defects of thalidomide-exposed baby rabbits, and she found 3 things. She found reduction in the number of large nerve fibres, proliferation of small caliber nerve fibres, and reduction of transverse fascicular area of the sciatic nerves. Now this, you'll recollect, is exactly the same neuropathology as found in adults with thalidomide neuropathy by Dudley O'Sullivan back in London. Therefore, whether this drug attacks the adult or the embryo, it targets the same cell, the sensory neuron, or its embryonic precursor, the neural crest. And either way, it produces the same neuropathology. Right, so we go now to do some work in Germany. Back in 1969, Henkel and Willett, 2 young German orthopedic surgeons, had analysed the limb anatomy in radiographs of over 200 German thalidomide children. They had to operate on these children, and they found such disorderly anatomy inside that they determined to try to work out what the drug was actually doing. And they discovered the pattern of thalidomide deformities of the limbs, and their publication in the Journal of Bone and Joint Surgery was a landmark paper in this whole area. They showed how a normal limb is depleted of bones through various stages of phocomelia till it gets down to no limb at all. And that was a great start. However, they couldn't explain the mechanism behind this pattern. I visited Professor Willett in Göttingen in Germany, and using his material and my method of analysis, he and I established in 1999 that the different skeletal malformations seen throughout a phocomelia are due to injury to one or more sensory nerve segments. That is, the pattern of the bone defects was the same as the sensory nerve supply of the skeleton. And our results are here. In his series, we found 80% of cases fitted the nerve supply exactly, 15% were a fair fit, and 5% were a poor fit with the sclerotome maps. So to conclude now, I'll want to summarise subsequent events in the history of this drug. Following the epidemic of birth defects, thalidomide was taken off the market from 1961, and it spent 30 years in the wilderness, where it was classed as an orphan drug. But it continued to be used to treat leprosy in Africa and South America, particularly Brazil. And in those countries, the next slide shows the packet insert that included this diagram, intended to inform illiterate women to avoid taking it in pregnancy. Across the red bar it says avoid pregnancy. But of course this is ambiguous. It was misconstrued to be a contraceptive. And with inadequate public safeguards, the drug leaked into the pregnant population, and over 250 thalidomide deformed children resulted. This is the third epidemic of thalidomide neuropathy. And here's one of these children in Brazil with absent radius bilaterally. Meantime, the Reagan administration from 1980 wanted American pharmaceuticals to dominate world markets. So that administration reduced the powers of the FDA in favour of Big Pharma, and reduced the FDA's function as a barrier test for drugs before their release into the community. This evolved into the 1990s, where modern society was in any case in thrall to advertisers, sound bites, spin doctors, and hype. The climate was right, therefore, to revive and remarket some orphan drugs, and among these was thalidomide. The next slide shows that 3 miracles were achieved by thalidomide's spin doctors. It was now touted as anti-angiogenic, much to the surprise of the neurologists around the world. Its inconvenient neuropathy disappeared, and its neuropathology simply vanished in the hype. We have to just divert for a moment into a discussion of why angiogenesis was seen as important. It was seen as important because many tumours are fed by newly formed tumour blood vessels. We radiologists actually see these vessels. They're in the angiograms surrounding certain tumours. So that it was argued that if there was a drug that could stop the development of tumour vessels, the cancers that they fed could theoretically be starved, and their growth thus reduced. That was the theory. More significantly, the world was full of cancer sufferers and oncologists desperately needing anti-cancer drugs. There was a worldwide market out there waiting. But not everyone was fooled by the spin. When you look back, you could say no vascular symptoms or signs of vascular disorders had been recorded in all the clinical literature, and neuropathy pathology and neuropathy was constantly reported in patients who took it. No vascular pathology was reported in all the histopathology on primate, rabbit and other animal research done since 1970. And neuropathology has been well established. The experiment said to prove its anti-angiogenic action is actually scientific nonsense. A blistering critique of that paper was made by pharmacotoxicologists in Berlin who'd had 40 years' experience with thalidomide in primates. And finally, that a neurotoxin can suddenly turn into an angiotoxin and lose its neurotoxicity is seen as totally absurd by the neurologists and indeed by any citizen applying the common sense test. So, the fourth thalidomide epidemic erupted. Resurrected as anti-angiogenic, a stopper of blood vessel formation, thalidomide returned to the market as an anti-cancer drug in the late 1990s. Its success in cancer is debated, and its use is in fact now waning. But in the year 2000, thalidomide sales earned $62 million for its New Jersey-based drug company. Extremely high doses were used in oncology. What is certain is that during thalidomide treatment, oncology patients acquired sensory peripheral neuropathy. They went down like 9 pins. 100% of the patients in some cancer series. And not at all surprising to anyone who's followed the history of the drug. Neuropathy in cancer sufferers is the fourth thalidomide epidemic. So there have been 4 epidemics of neuropathy, all of them sensory neuropathy, 2 of them in adults and 2 in embryos. The first was in adults who took it as a sedative. The second was in embryos whose mothers took it as an anti-nauseant. The third, again in embryos whose mothers thought it was a contraceptive. And the fourth in adults who, together with their doctors, were told that it was anti-angiogenic. Thalidomide's history is of 4 epidemics of sensory neuropathy. This surely proves its site of action to be the sensory neuron, not blood vessels. We can put all of the 4 epidemics together, and the result and the answer, if we haven't already seen it, is clearly that this is a sensory nerve poison.